we'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging, and that we're on various lands that haven't been ceded. Today's talk is jointly hosted by the Multilingualism Research Centre. So I'm going to hand over the hosting duties to Associate Professor Alice Chick, who is Deputy Director of the Multilingualism Research Centre. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to the seminar today. I'm Alice Chick from the School of Education and Multilingualism Research Center. It is my honor to introduce Professor Phil Benson from the Department of Linguistics and the Directors of Multilingualism Research Center at Macquarie University. In recent years, Phil has taken up interest in the spatial theory of language learning and teaching. I would like to believe that he was inspired by this road sign, Benson Place, near Top Right City shopping centers in Sydney. I'm not sure if you can see the words on the plaque. There is a little fountain next to the road sign, Benson Place, and it says you should be able to see the profile of Queen Victoria's face. Why Queen Victoria's? I do not know, but maybe this was the starting question for thinking about language, history, and space. If you would like to know more about spatial theory and language learning, please check out his book. I hope you can see this now. Language Learning Environment, Spatial Perspective on Second Language Acquisitions, published by Multilingual Matters in 2021. And the floor is all yours, Phil. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. So just sharing. Have we got that? So everybody, are we all looking at this? Yep. Okay. Yeah, as Alice says, thank you for the introduction, Joe and Alice. And as Alice said, it's based on, the talk's based on this book that I published. It came out a few months ago now, called Language Learning Environment, Spatial Perspectives on SLA. But I've given a few presentations on the language learning aspects of this over the last couple of years, and actually they only take up the last two chapters of the book. And what I want to do today is look at one of the earlier chapters, which I think is called, but anyway, it's about the spatiality of language. Now, the chapter before that was a whole literature review on critical theories of space, and I'm just going to take one. I'm going to try and boil that down to one basic idea. And the chapter on the spatiality of language, it poses a few questions about linguistics, and particularly the idea of linguistics as the study of language systems. So there's something of a critique here of the idea of the language system from a spatial perspective. And the following chapter sort of tries to offer some answers to these questions I'm posing here. It tries to sort of propose an approach to linguistics that doesn't involve systems, that is more integrated. But I'm not going to have time to get into that. So today you're just going to get the kind of the critique. And if you want to know the solution or possible solution, please have a look at the book, or if you like it, invite me back next year, and I'll talk about that. So to begin with, so the basic idea on space that I want to work with is a contrast that's shown in these two images between the idea of objects in space and objects as space. So there are two basic conceptions of space at work there. The one on the left, if you're as nerdy as me, you'll recognize that's the Starship Enterprise, and it's a fairly good example of an object in empty space. The image on the right is, I think it's by an engraving by Jean Duvet. it's a kind of what's known as oro vacui image, where every available space is filled. And the idea that that image is conveying is that objects are space, basically, that there is no empty space. And from the objects as space perspective, actually the Starship Enterprise picture is a bit of an illusion because there are two objects there. One object is the starship, and the other object is the space that's surrounding it, which appears to be empty, but actually, as we know, it's full of particles of hydrogen or whatever. It's not space. Space is actually never empty at all, but often it appears to be if you can pass through it. So the objects in space perspective basically argues that space is empty, flat, smooth, homogeneous. Objects exist in space, and objects move through or across space. And the relations among objects in space are measurable and often geometric. This is essentially the Newton's conception of absolute and relative space, which he introduced towards the end of the 1600s. Yeah. Now, a slight modification of that is also that objects exist in space, but objects can also be spaces in space. So now we're looking at the interior of the Starship Enterprise, and we can see that inside the Starship itself, we have a space. So when an object is of that character, then it has two main characteristics. One is that it's self-contained. That is, it's not part of this, it's self-contained in the sense that it's separate from the space that surrounds it. And it's also systemically organized in itself. So I guess the Starship Enterprise was this kind of self-sufficient system that kind of powered itself and could wander through space for indefinitely. Sorry, Mike. It's sensitive, I might miss things. From the objects as space perspective, space is basically the opposite of how it appears from an object in space perspective. So space is basically already full. It's uneven, it's sticky, it's not smooth. It's heterogeneous, it's not homogeneous. Objects are space. And because objects are space, then the movement of objects is their movement of space itself. So you have a kind of turbulence. When we think of mobility from this perspective, it's space itself, the whole field of space is moving rather than the objects within that space. And as a consequence, relations among objects are they're not so much measurable and geometric. They're kind of integrational, they're complex, and probably the best word to describe them is messy. Now, coming to language, we can apply that idea of objects in space to language. So if we think of language as an object in space, and my argument is that a great deal of linguistics does think of language as an object in space, then we would think of language as being self-contained, of consisting only of itself. That is what I mean by that. We think of language as being systemically organized. We think of language as standing in measurable or geometric relation to other systemic objects in space. And the main ones that we have in the social sciences are society, culture, mind, brain, technology. And if we think of linguistics as a study of language, then of course we have sociolinguistics, which studies what the relationship between language and society, or anthropological linguistics, looking at language and culture, psycholinguistics, the relationship between language and mind. But in all of these fields, these objects tend to be thought of as being separate, self-contained, and having their own systemic organization. So that we may think that language is integrated with society, but of course, linguistics has a completely different sort of language and set of terms for describing the organization of language, to sociology, which has its own set of terms for describing the internal organization of society. So it's very difficult to actually integrate the two into one object. So the agenda of linguistics from a language in space perspective is to look at how language is organized internally in terms of systems, structures, and networks, and also how the language system is related to other systems. And this is a kind of spatial way of looking at language. And I think we got to keep in mind here that linguistics is actually awash with spatial metaphors, and the system, structure, network. These are all terms that describe spaces, although they're quite readily applied to things like language. From the language as space perspective, then again, language is not a self-contained system. It's not a self-contained object. Basically, language is everywhere. And in everything and part of everything. Language has no internal system that we can hope to, at least that we can hope to capture, or rather there's no particular reason to believe that language has an internal system because it's not a self-contained object. Language is integrated with other objects in the world. And the agenda that we have from this perspective is really to think about how language fits into space, how language is integrated with other objects, for example, in speech, in writing, in print, in digital text, also actually in the names of things, and in various sorts of multimodal assemblages in which words and language are involved. Okay, so I'm dichotomizing and I'm oversimplifying to kind of provoke discussion. But basically, if we try to assign different approaches to linguistics to these different spatial concepts, then from the language in space perspective, the kind of the arch objects in space linguist is Saussure, as I'll try to show a bit later. We then have the sort of structuralist approaches that emerged from Saussure in the 20th century, Bloomfield, Hjelmslev, and so on, various people who call themselves structuralists. And then we have both the sort of generative approaches of Chomsky, the functional approaches, of which there are many, but I'll mention Halliday later, who, to be fair to them, Chomsky and Halliday certainly see language as being less self-contained as a system, and they tend to think more in terms of sort of networks and open systems than the structuralists did in the past. On the other side of the fence, if there is another side, the language as space, we have concepts, we have fields such as language ecology, complex and dynamic systems, integrationist, is it integrationist or integrationalist linguistics? I'm never sure, but I'm thinking there of Roy Harris and Nigel Love and his crowd. Distributed cognition approaches, the post-humanist approaches, Alistair Pennycook, and also people who work, I think, with indigenous knowledge systems. The indigenous knowledge is often seen as being dealing with a far more integrated world than the more traditional approaches to linguistics do. Now, to make that a little more complex, I don't think it's a level playing field. I don't think it's an even fight between the objects in space and the objects as space perspective, because the objects in space perspective is very much a sort of taken for granted everyday perspective on space. And it's actually quite difficult to think one's way out of that perspective in certain respects. So the objects in space view is Newtonian, essentially. It comes from, it's very usually associated with Sir Isaac Newton and his theories of dynamics, which posited an empty space, that the real existence of empty space. It was used by the natural sciences, obviously, because that's, you know, how they took it up, this Newtonian perspective, but it's largely been rejected since the theories of thermodynamics in the 19th century. So it doesn't have a great hold over the natural sciences anymore, but it seems to have been retained in various metaphorical ways by the social sciences, and especially, I think, by linguistics. And as I said, it's a kind of everyday, taken for granted way of looking at space. And what I mean by that is, if you look again at the picture of the Starship Enterprise there, it's very difficult to see that as a kind of field of objects, as a field of space that is composed of essentially two, or probably many more than two, objects. It's very difficult to see it as anything else other than a single object in an empty space. But an object as space view sort of insists that we have to see it as a field and not as an object in space. Now, to add something to this, which I think is rather interesting in the context of linguistics, is the idea that space is often produced. One of the reasons why it's difficult to sort of unsee this view of space is that space is very often produced in the image of an empty or geometric space. And if I give a few examples of this, these are pictures from Google Maps or Apple Maps, aerial pictures above Sydney. So these are, they're not exactly agricultural fields. They're growing grass for turf out near Windsor, in the northwest of Sydney. So here you have a case where, and actually most of Australia is like this. The land was cleared, it was turned into an empty space, and then it was rearranged as a geometric space. And of course, in the process, and the process of colonialism, that also involved clearing away the people, as well as the trees and other obstacles to creating this kind of flat, empty space. That's an agricultural landscape. We also see this in urban landscapes, in housing, and in this case, this is the factory, the industrial area in Wetherill Park in Western Sydney. Again, we see this space being created in the image of empty space. And interestingly, it also happens with language. And here's an example of language being produced in the image of a geometrically organized empty space. So this, of course, is a dictionary. And the way that dictionaries are made is you clear away, you take an empty page, and then you rearrange language on it in this kind of, the term I use for it is semiotic geometries, in which things like tabulations are particularly important. Matrix diagrams are very important. So I think what the point of this image and putting it next to the landscape images is to suggest that the processes that take place in the production of landscape are very similar actually to there's a kind of landscaping of language that goes on in dictionaries, but also in many other texts. Okay, so that's a kind of introduction of how basic ideas of space that I'm working with, have been working with, kind of apply to language and linguistics. I'm going to use, so in a way, the aim or the objective here is to try to denaturalize this language in space idea, to make it look odd, rather than to make it look like just the obvious way that we should go about analyzing language. And I'm going to use the word spatial metaphor in a particular sense. And as I say, linguistics is actually awash with spatial metaphors. Once you start reading linguistics with an awareness of spatial metaphor, it's actually difficult to find more than 3 or 4 words continuously in a text that are not spatial metaphor. Everything suddenly appears to be spatial metaphor. But I'm using it here in a very specific sense to mean representing, both representing and producing language in the image of a self-contained, systemically organized space in the space of the world. So certain approaches to linguistics assume that language is a self-contained, systemically organized space. But what I'm concerned with here is the use of metaphors which actually represent it in that way and even produce it in that way. So what linguistics is in danger of doing is kind of analyzing its own representation of language rather than analyzing language itself. I want to talk briefly about what I understand as the space of linguistics. We might think of linguistics as, say, the study of language. That would be the broadest definition of linguistics, I guess, that we could come up with. And then we would think about linguistics as being organized around this idea of language, that it's the sort of discipline that, that takes language as its object of inquiry. Here I want to argue that basically a disciplinary space, that the space of linguistics is more than this, that it involves an object of inquiry, but it also involves a disciplinary space, which is a physical space, and it also involves the space of professional and industrial practices around language, of which dictionary making is one. In regard to the object of inquiry, I think probably most of us anyway should know that linguistics is a fairly modern discipline as such, but of course the study of language or study of theory of language is much older. I believe that the first linguistics departments in universities were formed in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, around that time. But before that, in the 1800s, we had comparative philology, and in the 1900s, since the 1900s, really the object of inquiry of linguistics has been the language system. But before that, we had comparative philology or historical linguistics, which was very much concerned with the shared origins of language. Before that, we had grammar, which was slightly different to what we may think of as grammar now, which was concerned with the relationship of language to thought, and also concerned with language improvements, with standardization and improving languages. And before the 1600s, we had basically the study of languages for practical and pedagogical purposes. So people studied languages and analyzed language to some extent for purposes of second language teaching or translation. So the idea of language as a self-contained system first emerges fully in Saussure, and it develops in structuralist linguistics. and it opens out to a certain extent into networks and open systems with Chomsky and Halliday and others. So what one of the historical questions really is how did we get to that point? How did linguistics arrive at this point where it became linguistics, and linguistics became the study of the language system? What I mean by disciplinary space is that basically you cannot have a discipline just as a bunch of people who study a particular object of inquiry. What you get, in fact, is something much bigger than that, and something that's very physical in terms of space. And in the case of linguistics and all social science disciplines, in fact, you have university departments, laboratories, academic associations, networks, conferences, etc., all of these things which kind of make up the physical disciplinary space, and in a sense act as a guarantor for the object of inquiry. So once this kind of basically a disciplinary space is organized around an object of inquiry, and in that sense it's a metaphorical space, but it also becomes this kind of globally distributed site of academic labor, production of texts and ideas and so on, which kind of acts as a guarantor for the object of inquiry. So the idea, basically the idea of language as a system, the idea that language is a system is not just an idea, it's something that's really embedded in this very physical global disciplinary space that takes that as a central assumption. But what I want to argue also is that disciplinary space is not just organized around an object of inquiry, it's constantly producing that object of inquiry as well, both as abstract idea and as concrete objects in the space of the world. Now, this last idea, the production of language as a concrete object, involves the various language professions and industries that are associated with linguistics, such as second language teaching, producing pedagogical grammars, dictionary making, translation, editing and publishing, creation of artificial languages, which was interestingly is very important now in computational terms, but was a massive issue in the 17th century. That was really a heyday of the production of artificial languages, and I'll come to that in a moment. And these professions and industries work spatially in a double sense. One is that they are really the most sort of important agencies of language standardization that we have, and in that sense they work to territorialize languages and language boundaries and so on. But in another sense, they also tend to spatialize language as printed text, and particularly as printed text, and nowadays as online text. So one of the things that I'm being particularly interested in here is the way in which the language professions in particular, they are engaged in this physical production of language as a self-contained systemic object in space. So when I talked about the language being produced in the image of a geometric empty space, it's largely the language professions and industries that do that, while linguistics tends to theorize what they do. So the historical problem that I want to address really in the rest of the presentation, and I'm not going to be able to do it fully because there's about 500 years of history involved in this, so I'm only going to be able to touch on a few ideas. But the problem is how did the language system, as the object of inquiry, the disciplinary space of linguistics, and the language professions and industries, how did they co-emerge in the history of language inquiry, basically from the 1600s onwards? And also is to think about what is the driving force behind all this, and the role of the language professions and industries in this. And in that context, we need to think about, I think perhaps a starting point for thinking about that is that dictionaries and grammars really precede theoretical inquiry into the nature of language. So we tend to think of, I mean, nowadays we tend to think that applied linguistics, which basically involves these various language professions and industries, that applied linguistics is informed by theoretical linguistics. But I think historically, the opposite is the case, that in a sense, theoretical linguistics has been driven by applied linguistics and the various products, particularly in the earlier stages, dictionaries and pedagogical grammars. To start that, to go back to these, people get confused, I think, so in different languages. So I'll say the 1600s. I'm not trying to avoid saying things like the 17th century. I'll say the 1600s and 1700s and so on. You may know that the Oxford English Dictionary, one of the things it does is it includes lots and lots of quotations to exemplify the historical development of the sort of meaning and use of words. So these are a few examples which struck me as being very interesting for the word language as it appears in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a little complicated to read them because there's about 10 different senses of the word language listed in the Oxford English Dictionary. And we may not agree that those are really good divisions of the senses of the word, and they all have their own quotations. But looking through them all, what I found is that until the 1600s, the word language appears to have been used in two very specific senses. One is to refer to kind of the language of a specific place or of a specific person as being different to your own language. So the first one there is from Robert of Gloucester, and he's saying, I'll put it into sort of modern English, in the language of Rome, a rana, a frog is. So he's saying that the word for frog in Rome is rana. So that's referring to a specific language, the language of Rome. And then you have Chaucer, without any subtlety of speech, for hard language and hard matter is encumbrous to hear. I'm not sure what the last word means there, atones or at once, I'm not sure what it means. But here language is being used to refer to basically words, what somebody is saying. He's talking about hard language as being language that's difficult to understand. But in this last quote, which is the one I'm interested, by Milton, John Milton, the poet who wrote Paradise Lost, in a short, he was a schoolmaster before he was a poet, and he wrote a treatise on education. And in there he wrote that language is but the instrument conveying to us things useful to be known. And that's an interesting quotation, I think, because it's the earliest quotation, at least in the Oxford English Dictionary, that gives us an indication that language is kind of something other than itself, that it's something else. And here he's saying that language is an instrument, a way of conveying, a means of conveying information. Now, this may seem to be very obvious, but it seems to have taken several hundred years in English for anybody to really come up with this idea that language is not just language, it's a means of conveying information. And with that quotation then, I think we get several ideas that are current in the 1600s, which are related to this notion of language as an object in space. One is the simple idea that language is actually more than just itself. It's more than words. It's words that express some kind of ideas or thoughts. The idea that language is a means of expressing thought or reason, and that goes back philosophically, that's an idea that was put forward by Descartes in 1637, about the same time. There's also the idea that language is at least potentially kind of logical, that there's a logic behind it. and the logic is the logic of thought. And with that, the idea that languages can be universal, that basically there is only one language, but it has sort of different forms: French, English, Spanish, German, etc. And the word that was used at that time was general rather than universal. So you get lots of things. So nowadays, the Chomskyans and so on talk about universal grammar. In the 1600s, they talked about general grammar, but it was essentially the same thing. And of course, Chomsky actually, in his early career, he sort of leapt back to this period as a source of ideas, particularly Descartes and the Port Royal grammar. So what we have here then, I think around the 17th century, around the 1600s, is this emergence of language as a kind of proto-object in space and as a kind of a proto-system. And so, of course, if you read anything, if you read something like the Port Royal grammar, it really doesn't stand up against kind of modern descriptions of the language system. But in there, you can sort of pick out the idea that language is being represented as a system. Language in 17th century Europe at that time, what was happening to it? So why were these things coming up at that time? First of all, you had a secularization of scholarship. So for a long time, and actually going through to the 19th century, language was viewed as a gift of God, as something that had been created by God and given to people and messed up by the Tower of Babel. So the idea was emerging that language was no longer the gift of God, but it was something that was invented by human beings, but the thought was a gift of God. And human beings had invented language to reflect or to express reason or thought. It was also the period in which secular abstractions were emerging all over the place. And one of those at the end of the century was the idea of Newtonian empty space, which was essentially a secular version of the infinite space of God, of infinity, which was seen as a divine concept in Christianity. But Newton sort of transformed that into something real, something empirical. He argued that this infinite space of God was not divine, it actually existed. And there was also the rise of vernacular languages, the rise of print technologies and culture, and the rise of language scholarship in this period. So among the things that came out at that time were the Port Royal grammar, which, as I say, was particularly important for Chomsky. And that was produced, the authors Arnaud and Lancelot. Arnaud was a philosopher and follower of Descartes. Lancelot was a language teacher, second language teacher. So it was a sort of collaboration between a philosopher and a language teacher. And Lancelot had written several grammars of French, Spanish, Italian, I think, in 1660. There were a whole number of dictionaries. This was the period in which the monolingual dictionary, the dictionary of a single language, is first appeared. As I said earlier, there was a bit of a craze for creating artificial or logical languages. There were academies, particularly in Italy, France, and a bit later in Spain. This was the beginning of the period of language standardization and improvement, which sort of goes right through to the end of the 1700s, particularly. And also the development of technologies of semiotic representation. And the next slide, I think. Okay, so in here, this is the left-hand side is a picture of a dictionary which was produced in 1612. And it's actually very similar to, it looks very similar to dictionaries that are produced today, at least in print, not online, of course. So most of the technologies for producing it, for representing language in the form of a dictionary were in place. And the important thing is, I think, is that they were new technologies. So So if you look at this is the dictionary of the Academy della Crusca in Italy. It's not only a kind of achievement in language study, actually printing this dictionary in this form with these sort of tabulations and the different fonts and the different ways of representing the different parts of the dictionary entry. This was quite an amazing technological achievement in print. On the right-hand side is a page from John Wilkins' Essay Towards a Real Character in a Philosophical Language, and this is a very big book in which he's worked out this entire scheme for developing an artificial language based on logic and based on relations among concepts, rather than the sort of messy thing that is real language. Oddly, he doesn't seem to have noticed that the conceptual language, which is kind of better than English in his view, is actually English. So they struggled with this notion of how they could represent concepts without using an existing language. And in this case, he did choose to use English. Although it's very much more, his logical language is much more influenced by Latin than any other kind of written language of that time, because language was seen as more logical. I need to move on a bit faster. I'm going to leap forward about 300 years, 200 or 300 years, to Saussure, who's often called the father of modern linguistics. And his work was published in 1916 and actually written by his students rather than Saussure himself. So it's not clear that it's his work exactly, but it's been very influential, clearly. And here, the three key ideas, I think, that are relevant from Saussure is firstly, the idea that language, or la langue, as he called it, is a system in which all the elements fit together and in which the value of any one element depends on the simultaneous coexistence of all the others. He also said that language was a self-contained whole. So my idea that linguistics represents language as a self-contained system actually comes really directly from Saussure. And also he argued that la langue, or language, was no less real than speech. Linguistic signs are not abstractions, they are realities localized in the brain. Now, the really interesting thing for me about Saussure are the spatial metaphors that he uses. He describes la langue so these are just a few of them. He describes language as an institution. He says it's a complex mechanism with workings that cannot be intuitively grasped. Okay, so we're in the industrial age now. A totality of imprints deposited in each brain. He talks about the signs he describes as acoustic images. He says they are stored in a repository or a fund. He says that the speech community is linked by the social bond of la langue. And he also liked to make similes. He said that la langue language is like a game of chess. He said it's like the quincunx design of an orchard. If you're like me, you didn't know what that meant, so I put a little picture. Quincunx is the number 5 on a dice, arrangements on a number 5 in a dice. He said that the language was like the structure of a building, and so on and so on. There are literally hundreds of spatial metaphors in the course of general linguistics. And interestingly, he includes this quote in the World. He says that language has no immediately perceptible entities. And yet one cannot doubt that they exist, or that the interplay of these units is what constitutes linguistic structure. Sorry, that's Roy Harris's translation. Saussure didn't really use the word structure, although he's often described as a structuralist. He used the word system. And what he said there was not linguistic structure. He said, c'est le jeu qui les constitue. But the point was there, to me, is how far did he convince himself? How important were his spatial metaphors? This constant use of metaphors which represent language as something that is spatial and something that is kind of a real physical object in space. How far does his use of metaphors actually convince him that this thing that has no perceptible entities actually does have those entities, and that they're real, and their relationships is what makes language. Now, at the crux of kind of my argument about this is a couple of quotations from these two guys. On the right, you have Saussure, and he's looking rather admiringly at the person on the left, who is William Dwight Whitney. And the reason he's looking admiringly is because a lot of Saussure's ideas in the course in general linguistics actually also appear in a book that was written by Whitney in 1875 called The Life and Growth of Language. And Saussure acknowledges Whitney, but it doesn't. In the book itself, which is written by his students, we get the idea that there's really a sharp break between Saussure's linguistics and historical linguistics of the 1800s. But in fact, Saussure was also a historical linguist, and he drew a lot on Whitney. But the interesting thing is that Whitney made this quotation here. He said, talking about language, sorry. Oh yeah, no one can define in the proper sense of that term a language, for it is a great concrete institution, which you note is a metaphor that Saussure also used. A body of usages prevailing in a particular community, and it can only be shown and described. And then he said, you have it in its dictionary, you have it in its grammar. So what Whitney was saying there is that you can't actually say what a language is itself. All you can say really is what a dictionary is, and what a grammar is, and what you find in the dictionary, what you find in the grammar, that's a language. But actually the language itself is something that really escapes that, is something that's much bigger and much more diffuse than any of those things. Now, Whitney knew what he was talking about because he edited a 12-volume dictionary of English, the Century Dictionary. And the quote from Saussure, which kind of goes with it, is he says that a language, or la langue, is a collective phenomenon, takes the form of the totality of imprints in everyone's brain, rather like a dictionary of which each individual has an identical copy. So here Saussure is really arguing, he's really kind of resting his, in a sense, his entire case for this, this social existence of a language. How is it that each person in a speech community has the same language system in their head? He's saying, well, it's like they have a dictionary in their head. Now, of course, he would not have been able to say that. He would not have been able to put forward that argument if there were no dictionaries, if he had never seen a dictionary. And what seems likely here is that he is looking really at language as it's been represented, and is perhaps somewhat sort of deceived by that is language itself. Of course, nobody had a dictionary, an identical dictionary in their head, but by the end of the 1900s, most French people would have had an identical dictionary in their homes. And this is just a picture of, this is Saussure's speech circuit with Whitney's Century Dictionary inserted in the heads of the speakers. If I just take about 5 minutes, I'll run through very quickly. how these ideas work in Chomsky and Halliday. Chomsky again uses many spatial metaphors, and also, as you can see on the right-hand side, you get a lot of spatializations. Basically, language is represented in these kinds of diagrams, more sophisticated diagrams than tables, but they are spatial representations. So Chomsky, so apparently Saussure was not a structuralist, and Chomsky was not a structuralist either. He said he wasn't a structuralist, but he did write a book called Syntactic Structures, and he talks about deep and surface structures, transformations. Chomsky has the most extreme version of language as an object in space, in the idea that there is a language module in the brain, which seems to be a self-contained module within the brain, although nobody knows where it is, and actually it doesn't refer to language in the sense that most of us would refer to language, but the metaphor is there. And these are a whole series of words, spatial metaphors, which actually look quite sinister when you list them out: dominance, command, government, binding, subjacency, barriers, constraints, etc., which are used in Chomskyan grammar. Halliday, I think, is kind of more interesting in the sense that he did put forward this idea quite consistently during his writing, that language has had to be taken out of its glass case, which I think is quite interesting as a metaphor for kind of taking it out of its self-containedness, dusted and put back in the living environment. And Halliday's probably done as much as most modern linguists to try to do this, to put it back in, to put language back and to connect language with the environment. But again, his work is kind of trapped in a whole web of these spatial metaphors. So language is a semiotic system. This is just from one article that he wrote near the end of his career. Science systems are expanded. There are 4 dimensions. They can be combined, uncoupled, layered, networked, etc. Systems that make up networks are called organizational spaces. He talks about lexical items being in the more delicate regions of a continuous lexicogrammatical space. And on the right-hand side, we know that Halliday was very fond of this kind of diagram to represent delicacy in language. So while he talked about connecting language with its environment, he was also very fond of creating these kind of diagrams which are pretty far removed from language in use in their semiotic form. Okay, so to finish up, so the Oxford English Dictionary, actually the definition of linguistics is the scientific study of language and its structure. So structure is in that definition. And the Oxford English Dictionary of Language is that it's a system of communication, typically consisting of words used within a regular grammatical and syntactic structure. Now, not all linguists would agree with those definitions, I think. But the fact that they're there in the OED means they're pretty powerful definitions that are fairly widely accepted. And basically, just in a few words, my argument is that I think the systemic view of language, the structural view of language, is convincing because it's based on an objects in space metaphor. And the metaphor of a world of self-contained, systemically organized objects that circulate in empty space. Without these metaphors, there's not a lot left of the language system argument. An objects as space metaphor leads elsewhere, really to an account of how language is integrated with, as Halliday put it, the living environment of the physical world. And as I say, I'd be happy to talk about how I think that can be done based on assemblage theory, particularly, but not now. So that's it. That's me. Thank you. Thank you for listening.